So this is my video on Critical, my game for the 2022 ACTE Tech Fair. This is just going to be me talking about the process and path that I took to make this game, and I'll put in visuals and footage of me doing things that I'm talking about to go along with what I'm saying. Also, this isn't me playing the game live, this is a video of me playing it that I recorded earlier, and I'm just going to have it on in the background so you can get a feel for what the game is like to play. So, here we go. That video you just watched was the trailer that I put together for Critical, and the music that I was playing for it is the theme of the game, which I made on FL Studio. I don't have the music on for the gameplay here because it was a little distracting, but I'll play it as I explain how I made it, along with everything else. So anyway, here's how I made the game. I've been developing Critical for 7 months now, and I've been using Unity, the engine I created it on, for 11. I'll cover how I developed the game in chronological order from then, covering the key moments and important stuff of how I developed the game. So this all started with me starting Unity in C# around April to May last year, and starting with making these red boxes move around on a big blue plane. It sounds simple, but this was the first time I'd ever done any 3D game development, so I was pretty excited about it. After that, I decided that I wanted to learn how to make a first-person game, where you control a character inside a world, seeing everything through its eyes. I found some YouTube tutorials, especially by Brackeys, which helped me learn a lot of things about the game development system in Unity. I had constructed this really garbage movement system after about a week, but I decided that I wanted to improve it with rigid bodies, which are simulated physics objects. That means I can have gravity used on it, collide with other things, and interact with other rigid bodies. I wrote this code which takes the input from the player on the horizontal and vertical axis and moves the rigid body into the correct direction. This was when real development on the game began. I put the player on a big square in the sky with some other cubes to run and jump around on, and this was the environment I used to build the game in for around half of its development. I decided that the next thing I needed to add was a jump pad, because I always thought it was cool how you could boost yourself up high in the air through going to a certain spot, and thought that this would make for some interesting movement mechanics. And I never ended up using it. After I'd coded the jump pad, I felt pretty confident with my abilities and decided to start adding some weapons. This is where the next issue came along, 3D modeling. I had never used any kind of 3D modeling software before, but I decided to start using Blender, the most popular free 3D modeling software. I ended up constructing this really janky looking gun, but at the time I was really proud of it and decided to make it a laser explosive shooting kind of thing. I called it the Blaster, very creative, and it used a raycast going in the camera's direction forwards until it hit a collider like a wall, and then took the coordinates of the point it hit and checked the sphere with a decently large radius around that point for anything it would want to damage, like an enemy. But there were no enemies at the time, so it was pretty useless. I decided to fix that by making it possible for you to blast yourself up in the air forwards with it by shooting at the ground that you stood on, and using the explosion to launch yourself from the center of that point using Unity's rigidbody.addExplosion force method. I also added a little recoil animation in the gun and a sound effect for it with a particle system for some energy going through the barrel of the gun. Next up on my list of things to do was add an enemy. I decided to use Blender again to model, rig, and texture a guy who would run around and throw fireballs at you. There was only one small problem. I had no idea how to use Blender to model, rig, or texture a guy, and had no idea how to make anything run around or throw fireballs. I began by making a simple, low polygon count character and creating a UV map of him to paint the texture on, but I can't show you this part because a couple months later, I opened the project up and completely destroyed the guy with 0 backup saved. I still have this texture of him, though. After that, I rigged him by creating bones and parenting the 3D model to it. After that, I could control his movements by dragging and rotating the bones. So I took him back into Unity and used Unity's animation system with the rig to make a running, idle, and throwing animation for him. In the end, I had these 3 lovely animations which looked super professional and would obviously wow any AAA game dev studio looking to hire me. Then, the only task left for me was to make him actually chase you, throw stuff at you, and actually do AI stuff. Thankfully, Unity has a built-in system for this, the NavMesh system. It involves adding a NavMesh agent component to something and putting it on a surface which Unity knows is stable by marking it as static. All you have to do from there is set a location for the NavMesh agent to travel to in code, and it'll figure out the pathfinding stuff for you, which I'm very thankful for because if I had to make pathfinding AI by myself, I would have given up long ago. Somehow, though, this system still proved to be annoying enough and took me around a week to get working. I ended up making the AI set its destination to your coordinates every frame unless it successfully hits a mid-range raycast pointing towards you, in which case it will just stand still and stare at you in a pretty creepy way. I needed to fix that, and fix the other problem of it literally just gliding towards you in a standing position instead of actually walking. I don't have very much footage of this part of development, so this should sum it up. I could finally use those animations I made earlier, so I checked if the agent was moving, standing still, or standing still because it's looking at you, and set the animation for each state depending on its status. After that, the stresses of privileged first world life got to me, and I was feeling pretty bloodthirsty, so I decided to make it killable. I set an HP variable on it, which was completely redundant because the gun I had was so strong it would kill it in one blast anyway. I didn't know exactly what to do once it died anyway, because as soon as I stopped the script controlling it, it would kind of just go brain dead and stop moving. Thankfully, guess what Unity has? If you guessed a built-in system, congratulations. Unity's ragdoll system is basically just a way for you to make anything with the skeleton go limp and flop over in a really comedic way. I mean, look at this, that's just amazing. The setup for this is fairly simple too. All you have to do is add a ragdoll component and press this button and watch as the funny algorithm does its calculations while you sit there and drool pretending you're smart. Then I just had to make each part of the enemy activate its rigid body upon death, and now he flops over and writhes? Yeah, that's not supposed to happen. Unity may be good, but it doesn't simulate rigor mortis. I couldn't find a solution for this either. It doesn't matter anyway, because now I can show this people and they'll think I'm a coding genius for simulating rigor mortis anyway, so it doesn't matter. So the next thing I needed to do was make the guy throw an actual thing at you, which would damage you upon impact. I needed a few things to do this. The fireball for him to throw, and the feature to actually be able to take damage. But to show you how much health you have versus the amount of damage you've taken, you need a health bar, which means you need some UI. In some engines, adding UI can be a pain, but Unity has a built-in system. That's right, using the canvas, you can add 2D images to your 3D game, which will always render on top of everything else on your screen. So I made this border for the health bar and decided to fill it up with this translucent blue liquid for your health. I needed to make it go down proportional to your health variable, but thankfully, Unity has a built-in system. I added the slider component with the health bar and made it fill to the right based on how much health you have out of 100. I just made a small script for it and linked it to the player script, and it was good to go. Now that you had health, I needed to make it possible for you to lose it. I made each fireball, which looks disturbingly similar to an orange, perform a small raycast in front of it to detect if it hits either a player or a wall. If it hits a wall, the fireball disappears, making no impact, but if it's a player, the fireball calls a function inside of the player to do 20 damage. By this time, I had changed my game to, instead of a peaceful walking simulator, to a game where a man stalks you and throws oranges at you. Arguably an upgrade. Now that my game was professional enough to be picked up by Ubisoft or EA, I wanted to add some more weapons to it. I started with what's probably the most original concept for a gun you've ever heard of, adding an AK-47. I started my work in Blender, and completely from memory, painstakingly created the most stupid-looking thing you have ever seen in your life. I mean, look at this. After I got bullied on Discord about it for a while, I realized that it actually was crap and tried again, but this time I would do it differently. I used a reference image. It is absolutely insane how much difference that made. It went from this to this. I was finally socially acceptable again, and that caused an ape-like reaction in my brain that made my productivity skyrocket for the next couple days. I got the gun put into the game, and decided that I would make this one a fully realized working firearm, not just a blank textured circle magic thing that made the guy go boom. I was going to have an animated crosshair, animations for when the gun shoots, ammo counters, reloading, aiming, a muzzle flash, bloom textures, and so much recoil that it would dislocate your arms in real life just by touching it. The only problem is that doing that takes an attention span of more than 16 seconds, and adding some features wasn't worth the withdrawal symptoms of my crippling 5-second video addiction. Anyway, I pushed through, and over the next week, added all these to the AK by using a line render for the bullet trail thing, particle systems for the part where the bullet lands, and a particle system with an attached light for the muzzle flash. As for the recoil, I just pushed the gun back towards the player by a random amount, and moved it up, down, left, or right by a random amount, then would constantly lerp it back to the original position. If you don't know what lerping is, it's every single game developer's favorite thing. All you have to do is put in two variables and a number for how fast you want the first one to approach the second one, and over multiple frames, it'll smooth the number between the two values. So just put in the position minus a number on the z-axis in, and then the number before you moved it, and something like 0.01, and you've got something that looks passable for actual coding. The next two features were going to be a bit more annoying to do, the crosshairs and the bloom. As for the bloom, I just made it so that each time the gun shot, a number went up for how much randomness was going to be applied for the direction of the next shot, and then it would add the number each time the gun shot. I don't really want the gun to be shooting this chaotically though, so I had to add aiming down sights, but we'll get to that later. For the crosshairs, I just put in a little line in the center of the screen which moves differently depending on what you're doing with the gun, and whoa, this is the worst code I've ever seen. When I made this, I didn't want to just put it into a function for some reason, that when I duplicated the line 4 times for the rest of the crosshairs, I cloned the code every time until I had this absolute dumpster fire of a script, burning out my retinas by looking at it. At least it works, I guess. Now time for aiming. I've set up a function that checks if you're right-clicking and sets a variable to 1, which moves the point where the gun's supposed to be to the center of the screen, and rotates it to be facing straight forward. It lerps to both of these values, of course, and I even made the FOV of the camera decrease a bit, so it looks zoomed in. So now I was finally done with the AR. After testing it on some orange throwing guys, I decided that it was time to improve the level I was running around in. I'd just been using this group of cubes for the past few weeks, and I was ready to try and do something that looked actually good. I created a brand new level and tried to do some baked lighting, because I wanted to make some bars on the side of the room that would illuminate it. But you can't really do emissive textures without baked lighting, so I tried to learn what that is. It's basically when you have really complex lighting, so you have to let the game figure it out before it starts, so you don't get a PowerPoint slideshow when you run the game. So I hooked up all this baked lighting stuff and played with it for like an hour before I figured out how to actually bake it, and it just didn't work. I pressed bake and waited like 5 minutes for it to do its thing, and it just looked like most of the walls had glow stick liquid sprayed on them. After staring at the screen and doing absolutely nothing in anguish for 30 minutes, I made the mature and responsible choice to give up. The best decision I've ever made in my life. I would use real-time lighting instead, which is basically just baked lighting without the mental illness. Instead of adding one light, pressing bake, waiting 15 minutes, and crying when you realized the light was 1 inch too far to the left, and you had to bake it all again, you just put the light down, and it works. I decided to make a level that would be a facility inside space, so I set the skybox to a galaxy, and made this weird bathroom-looking room with a fluorescent light in a window. At the time, I thought this was the coolest thing anyone had ever made. I finished up the basic outline of the level and threw in some stuff that I thought would be cool, like a jump pad to another floor area, and 2 objects that I would use once I implemented 3 mechanics I had on my mind. Sliding, wall running, and vaulting. For sliding, I wanted you to be able to be running along and then press a button to crouch down, giving you a big speed boost, but diminishing the longer you touched the ground until you stood up again. Wall running would just be the standard hop onto a wall, tilt the camera, and have you go across it while you slowly go further down the wall, just like my brain cell count while I was making this game. Vaulting was easily the most complex out of all of these. Basically, instead of running into a wall and getting brain damage, you would run into a wall and climb up on top of it, making parkour in general a lot safer and easier. To add sliding, I made the movement script check if you've pressed the control button and scale the player down, then give a movement boost, and every frame the grounded variable returns true, decrease it a bit until it matches the normal movement speed, but negative, so you come to a complete standstill. This had a cool side effect though, because if you jump directly after starting to slide, the game wouldn't see you as grounded, and it wouldn't decrease the variable, basically giving a huge movement boost which you could keep as long as you tried to jump. This had a cool side effect though, because if you jump directly after starting to slide, the game wouldn't see you as grounded and not decrease the variable, basically giving you a huge movement boost which you could keep as long as you jumped quickly on the ground to stay on it for the lowest amount of time possible. I decided to do what every game developer does and not fix it, because I can just pretend that it's intentional and I planned it from the start, because it's definitely a feature and not a bug. For wall running, I checked the player's sides with the raycast and made the right raycast rotate your camera to the left and vice versa for the left raycast. Then you just increase the movement speed and make you go down and you're good to go. Vaulting was easily the most annoying out of all of these. The mechanic was fairly easy to add because I coded it in about the worst way you possibly can, constantly checking a short distance in front of the player to see if it's running into a wall, and if it is, I would do a raycast from a level above the player's head, checking to make sure the point where the raycast began wasn't a collider, because if I didn't do that, you would just teleport into a wall, and then if it wasn't in a collider, do a raycast down from there to find the closest point on the surface and teleport the player to those coordinates. That was all pretty easy, but now for the tough part, making it look like the player didn't just teleport up the wall. I spent more than 5 hours working on that one thing and never could get it to look right, but here's what I did anyway so I can feel kind of validated for it. I decided to offset the camera position by how long the distance was you teleported and then ease the camera back up to the correct position, and believe it or not, that actually worked, and vaulting up the walls was completely seamless. Just kidding, it's impossible for something to work out like that. Instead, the transition would work perfectly except for one frame where it would just completely glitch and the surface you were hopping onto would take up the whole screen. I kid you not, the entire mechanic worked perfectly except for one singular frame which would instantly alienate anyone with epilepsy from playing the game. After tons of different attempts at fixing the issue, from freezing the camera display for 0.01 seconds to whenever you start the vault, After tons of different attempts at fixing the issue, from freezing the camera display for 0.01 seconds whenever you start to vault, to making it move upwards when the vaulting started, nothing ended up working for the camera smoothing, and I just had to deal with the teleporting. I could have at least added an animation or something, but at that point I didn't want to bash my face into another wall one more time, so I just chose to leave it at that. Next, I decided to add another enemy to the game because I was getting tired of the exact same orange-throwing green alien guys and thought it would be cool for a close-range kind of enemy to aggressively chase you on the ground so you couldn't just take cover behind one surface and stay there, picking off all the enemies. So all I had to do was think of what the enemy would actually be. I wanted something kind of scary and intimidating, so I thought for about 15 seconds about it, and my last neuron decided to fire the word scorpion, so that's what I chose to do. I loaded up Blender and started modeling and rigging this little guy. Look how precious. I textured him with these glowing eyes and stinger and a striped scribble pattern, but you can't see the pattern anyway, so he just ended up looking like one color, which is fine. Then I put him into Unity and made him chase after you at ridiculously high speeds, then made animations of him running at you, stinging you, and dying. For his close range attack, he lunges at the player, unhinging his tail and moving it forward much more than should be physically possible. To check if he can attack you, he's doing a raycast from his face forward all the time he's alive to see if there's a player there, and if so, does the animation and damages the player. I felt pretty good about my progress with the Scorpion and decided to leave him like that. At this point, the one gun that I had in the game didn't feel like it was good enough, especially for close quarters combat. To fix that, I embraced my inner patriot and decided to add an old-fashioned double-barrel shotgun to the game. I got another reference image because I wasn't going to make the same mistake and started working Blender. I felt pretty good with how it turned out and dragged it into Unity, then added this reloading animation. Now you might think you're ejecting old shells and putting new ones in, but in reality, you're just taking the shells out and putting them back in from the other side. As an American, I can confirm that that's exactly how firearms work. I wanted to make it shoot a load of pellets in random directions, so they would be less accurate at a distance and much more accurate up close. So I wrote this code which fires each one in a random direction and follows pretty much the same code as the AK bullet, just doing less damage for each pellet, so a shotgun blast isn't equivalent to a nuclear warhead. Anyway, I felt pretty good with the mechanics at this point, but decided that the game didn't look good enough. So it was time to lather on a bit of every game developer's next favorite thing to lerping, post-processing. A pretty good way of understanding post-processing is by taking an overcooked steak and covering it with so much seasoning that you can't see the steak anymore. What's under the seasoning may be terrible, but you're so distracted by the coat of decoration on it that you don't notice. The best part of it all, it takes virtually no effort to add because Unity has a pretty versatile post-processing system. By versatile, I mean it's possible to either darken the screen to black or add so much bloom that you forget what a shape is. I ended up going with a vignette, chromatic aberration, motion blur, and enough bloom that looking at a light would cause a few pixels on my monitor to die. And there I had it! All the game mechanics I wanted to add were pretty much all there. The only thing I had left to do was the actual fun part, making a level. I decided to go for this floating island design for no other reasons than that it looked cool and I could add floating panes of glass to wall run between islands. I made one island 3D model which I would end up using for every single island on the entire map, and then got it into Unity where I added grass to the islands. I needed a goal for the level though, so I decided on a big island at the end, which the goal of the level would be to reach. I added some more islands to the game, made a tree and a bush with Unity's tree system, made this rock by going into Blender and doing some hijinks with a Voronoi map. Don't ask me what that is, but it looks like a rock when you put it on a cube and turn the size down and intensity up. So I stuck it in the game with a cobblestone texture on it and called it a day. After I finally got the whole added, I just had to do a few more things like a main menu, music, checkpoints, enemies, and menus for when you die and when you beat the level. I decided to make the main menu from a panning shot of the camera rotating around the level, and made my buttons actual 3D models, made this logo and a knife to put into it, and then made respawn, continue, victory, and menu into buttons for the rest of the game. To add enemies, I just put some scorpions around the map with some nav mesh links between islands for them to jump between. To add checkpoints, I put in these walls with the game logo on them which break once a certain amount of enemies is reached in the level. So when you pass a checkpoint, it changes the place you'll spawn if you fall off the map, so you won't have to traverse the whole level each time you fall. The last thing I wanted to add was music. All that I had to do to make the one that you're hearing right now is to put this sound I found into a synthesizer which gave it that synth sound, and then used like 6 or 7 different drum samples for the drums, patterning them together like this. I did make another song for the main menu though, which sounds like this. You can listen to the full song on my channel if you want. That one I just made by doing the same thing, but with different drum sounds and a guitar. So after that, I was finally done with the game. All it took was 7 months and the loss of my entire social life. Anyway, bye.